Despite receiving rather positive reviews from the press, I recall Metroid Prime Echoes developing a negative reputation from fans at the time. I have no specific recollection of impressions, and if I had to hazard a guess based on what I can find, any complaints largely centered around light and dark worlds being perceived as trite, a knee-jerk dislike of the limited beam ammunition, and the Sky Temple keys being an even worse execution of the prior release's artifacts. Myself, well, I only played the game through once. I didn't dislike it, but if I ever wanted to play a Prime game in the years following, I would return to the first one. Over time, this has become a memory of Echoes being the inferior of the two to me. Recent articles and videos from fans new and old seem to disagree, with Echoes often being lauded as the best of the bunch. Given that the recent release of Metroid SAMUS Returns had me hungry for more of the franchise, I figured, why not give it a whirl? See if maybe these other critics and fans had it right. I'm not sure if I can definitively claim there is a best in regards to the series, but I do think Echoes is a step in the right direction for design in the 3D Metroid. Before I can explain why, though, we have to jump back into the past. I'd hate to be that guy that insists Super Metroid is the best of the side-scrolling bunch, but in regards to its map design, it's kind of true. Metroid 2 Return of Samus, here represented by and extended to AM2R as well as Metroid Samus Returns on 3DS, is a linear experience that focuses on dropping the player further and further down into the depths of SR388. The only way to progress back to early areas is to manually take yourself there. While both Samus Returns and AM2R institute quick travel systems to make it easier to backtrack, the original game and its design were uninterested in doing so. This leads to the time-consuming process of returning to prior sectors with new upgrades to... guess I just gotta come back later, when there's even more I gotta backtrack through. The original Metroid, here represented by its remake Zero Mission, lacks the structure of the later games. While this Game Boy Advance version swaps around some upgrades and adds objective markers, it still inelegantly bounces the player between zones like a ping pong ball. Go down an elevator, grab an upgrade, then head back up the elevator for the next, only return back down for another, and so on. Objectives may act as signposts for the player, but these are almost necessary as the map itself provides the player with no assistance. Chambers, upgrades, enemies, they're simply there, placed in a non-linear fashion to give a sense of exploration made linear through new obstacles and beacons. While backtracking is certainly a trait commonly recognized in Metroid games, Super Metroid features a much more elegant way of doing this. Different passages and chambers are designed so that the game frequently loops back around in on itself, helping to guide the player to where they need to go or creating easy shortcuts to prior sectors. It's very careful in how it goes about this though. Early on, the game locks the player into a limited area to reduce the amount of space it can explore in. You may recall in my Metroid Other M video that Fusion does the same thing, but just as it made no effort to hide how token each sector's theme was, it makes no effort to disguise its purpose here. By segregating each sector so clearly, it suggests an inability to trust the player. Super Metroid uses a much more deft touch. The first instance of a lock is in Criteria, following the descent into Old Torian. Until the player gets both the Morph Ball and at least one missile pack, the former necessary in order to retrieve the latter, they cannot escape back to the surface. This lock forces the player into a limited playground that will teach them the basic exploration in Super Metroid. Given the context of the lock, most players will likely view it with a sense of foreboding. It adds to the creepy atmosphere the game is trying to convey, an atmosphere and justification completely absent in Fusion. Continuing onward, the amount of space available for the player to explore increases, until passing through this gate exiting Brinstar. Between needing the Wave Beam, High Jump, and Ice Beam, this vertical passage acts as a major lock preventing the player from returning to Brinstar. Now Norfair acts as its own sector, limiting the amount of space the player can explore and, more to the point, get lost in before it expands beyond control. Any aimless wandering at this stage is minimized. The real accomplishment here is that this lock and separation does not segregate the world like in Fusion. Not permanently at least. Brinstar and Norfair are still clearly linked, and, depending on what the player does upon retrieving the power bomb, a new route to Crateria is established. Sure, to continue story progression, all they need to do is descend back down to Norfair to open some doors or a floor, the same sort of ping-ponging I critiqued Zero Mission about. But that is a choice to the player, and given the appeal of Super Metroid as exploration, it's much more likely they'll ascend into unknown territory, which turns out to be well-known territory. Sort of. You show up in a new region of Crateria and are free to loop right back around through familiar territory. Wait, isn't this just a more roundabout method of backtracking like in Metroid 2? No, because this backtracking was not only encouraged by the game, but the upgrades just to get back up that vertical shaft also open up a lot of Brinstar, allowing the player to not only increase their arsenal, but to also learn new abilities thanks to the local denizens. This observation is kind of like that golden ratio or Junji Ito horror story. After having noticed this first major loop, I began to pick up on other examples throughout the franchise's design. I may have criticized Metroid Zero Mission for ping-ponging the player around, but just about every side passage or major pathway loops back into a central chamber. Even Metroid 2 and its remakes involve such features of design. But Super Metroid elegantly applies it to the entirety of the world design to large and small degrees. Dead ends tend to be immediate, and a large portion of the game's linear passages wrap right back around on themselves in some way. Take this big chamber in Norfair for instance. Drop down this door, fight your way through a few corridors, and you're right back in that big chamber. While you now have access to a new room, it also allows you to swiftly make your way back to the central shaft rather than retracing all of your steps. Even Meridia brings you back to Norfair, precisely where the player needs to be in order to fight Ridley. And you know what? More than 20 years later, I finally discovered this hidden passage looping right back up to Upper Norfair. Do you know how long I forced myself to backtrack through this stupid room? Now, I did say Super Metroid is the best of the side-scrolling bunch, but it's not perfect. The wrecked ship feels pretty out of place, and most first-time players I know tend to stall out right around Meridia. Man, I tend to stall out right around Meridia. If the majority of Super Metroid is an improvement and refinement on the first game, then I feel the expansive, labyrinthine size of Meridia is the game's attempt to refine on the massive chambers of Metroid 2. Unfortunately, it never feels as connected to the rest of the world, partially because it only has two connections, the wrecked ship and Lower Brinstar. Perhaps it's more that it's the last territory in the game though, given that Norfair is similarly cut off, yet it sits so conveniently in the game's progressive path. Maybe having both the wrecked ship and Meridia is too much game and one of these territories should have just been cut out. Maybe, with a bit of rearranging, these areas all could have connected better. Or maybe, just maybe, the central hub connecting different sectors in Metroid Fusion wasn't a bad idea, it just wasn't executed properly. Until Metroid Prime Echoes. My knee-jerk response to the hub world, the realization that Echoes itself was implementing a similar map design to Fusion and Other M, was negative. Even if I didn't realize it at the time, this had to be why I enjoyed the game less than its predecessor, right? Exploring the Agon Waste seemed like a confirmation. Like the initial run through Fusion sectors, Agon Waste is completely self-contained. There's a slight difference in how both games handle this initial sector concept though. In Fusion, the game is frequently giving you objectives in and out of each zone, but as time progresses, the guided tour of the space station slows down. The player becomes forced to find the pathways on their own and create connections between different sectors. The game may open up with an establishing pattern, but that pattern is gradually broken. The video gaminess, as much as I hate that term, is stripped away over time. Never completely, but much less directed than at the start. Echoes, on the other hand, establishes an incredibly video-gamey process from the get-go. Each sector will have 3 dark temple keys you must collect in order to fight that territory's boss, allowing SAMUS to collect the light of that zone necessary to restore Aether and banish the Dark World. It's an organized MacGuffin fetch quest that promises to the player this process will need to be repeated every sector. The biggest mistake of Agon Waste is that the player never has to leave. All of this is done in the sector without any need to go elsewhere, thus suggesting, on top of the 3 keys in the boss fight, that every sector will be the same. Newbie players following the hint system will have an advantage here, but anyone that's shut it off by default may find themselves stuck in wandering Torvus Bog a while. Sure, not everyone will waste a bunch of time trying to figure out where to go next, finally losing patience and turning the dang hint system on for a flippin' cue. It doesn't change that a pattern had been established. Rather than gradually dissolving the pattern a la Fusion, the pattern is immediately broken in the next sector without informing the player. Even without the hint system, the player should be able to intuit which direction they should go next. This is where Echoes can learn from Super Metroid's loops, and to an extent its GameCube predecessor. In addition to the many examples already discussed in Super Metroid, the original Prime does an excellent loop early on within the Chozo Ruins. Depending on the player's approach, they may encounter an elevator descending down to Magmore before fighting the boss Flagra. The need to resist heat is quickly established to such players. Even if this elevator is not encountered, the player is rewarded with a heat-resistant Variosuit after defeating the hostile plant monster, and then given access to a passage that leads right back to that elevator to Magmore. One way or another, the player is told that they need to next go down this elevator, which is the pathway leading to their next destination of Phendrana Drifts. Unfortunately, the original Prime kind of breaks down as well. It still has loops of its own, but there are several dead-end moments. After the game naturally leads the player to the crashed frigate, they descend all the way down to be told they reached a dead end. Long-time Metroid fans will know they've got to obtain the gravity suit, but in order to do so they have to trek all the way back to Phendrana. This is where a nearby elevator could have really helped direct the player in the necessary direction, but the closest elevator leads to this seemingly pointless cove on Talon Overworld. The same cove that the wrecked ship ends up going to, and is the only major entrance to the Phazon mines for a while, and you know what? This is just Meridia all over again. I understand planning a map so big, especially in a 3D environment, is a massive undertaking, but this is where Echoes as a hub world is at an advantage, and indicates how this design could even work in a 2D game. Fusion placed the hub above all the other sectors, which makes a bit of sense seeing as the games traditionally have the player descend into the world. However, if we instead place that hub in the center of all other sectors, like in Echoes, then we automatically create a central node by which every sector can connect. In a two-dimensional game, you might want the surface to be the topmost sector, but not the hub. As we've already established, though, Echoes itself isn't perfect. It at least provides one direct connection between each sector, so Aegon has one elevator to Torvis and one elevator to Sky Fortress, Torvis has one elevator to Aegon, and so on and so forth, but the elevators seem to be placed out of obligation rather than to create a consistency in the world or encourage the player through a path. With just a bit more work, Echoes could have been perfect. Let's take a closer look at Torvis Bog for both good and bad examples of what I mean in regards to loops and directing the player without relying on hints. As soon as the player enters this sector, they see an inaccessible bridge leading to a door. Automatically, a curiosity is established as to where that door goes, and the player creates a mental objective, be it primary, secondary, so on, to get to that door. The game leads the player through a linear path that gradually opens up more and more pathways, swiftly making Torvis a more interconnected location. The player is never directly told what to do or where to go, but they feel as if they're making discoveries and uncovering a puzzle through the natural progression of the game. But once the player gets the super missile and speed booster, Torvis drops the ball and leaves the player without any sense of where to go. The closest hint to the next destination are some doors requiring the Seeker Missile, a new upgrade to Echoes and thus an unknowable entity to any first-time players despite familiarity with the prior games. Rather than directing the player back to the hub, the player has to guess that their next destination is in the hub. Or is it an Aegon? Aegon had plenty of locked doors after all, and hey, remember how Super Metroid locked the player's progress to keep them from wandering aimlessly? What Retro should have done is relocate the Seeker Missile to Aegon, and instead of requiring the Seeker Missile to access this connecting elevator to the wastes, make it a Super Missile door that immediately takes the player back into familiar territory filled with upgrades and granting them the next key item. You know, similar to how that whole backtrack through Brinstar worked. I may sound like I'm being down on Echoes, and I'll be honest that all my notes on the game are. However, returning to Metroid Prime again after playing this sequel, I finally realized just how easy it would have been to get lost without the hint system. The only reason I don't is because I've played the game several times, unlike Echoes. I remember too much of it. That I only got lost in Echoes twice, one of which being the fault of this really badly designed Spider-Ball track. Why doesn't it contrast with the background better? Shows to me that its hub world was a step in the right direction, just not quite there. Now, before I wrap things up, I'd like to discuss one final, seemingly inconsequential thing I really loved about Echoes. When I first began this project, I didn't really have much of a thesis. I figured I'd quickly replay Prime's 2 sequels and see how well they did in regards to environmental storytelling. Really, I just wanted an excuse to play these games for the first time in 10 or more years. Echoes still focuses on telling the story of a world, but it has some more traditional cutscenes and dialogue to provide exposition and context. Perhaps some players never really knew why they were doing what they were in Prime, and thus the Luminoth were given a more prominent role. Regardless of why dialogue has increased, the main focus is still on the planet of Aether, its war with the Ing, and the Phazon meteor that created the rift between light and dark worlds. The Phazon meteor that gradually draws Dark Samus to this world. While it's not front and center, Echoes does a lot more to firmly present a concept of who Samus is than it first seems. There is an anecdote in the Galactic Federation Trooper log wherein a female soldier confesses her admiration for the bounty hunter, only to be told by another that Samus is a myth. While this is a cool, pride-swelling log that also suggests how large the universe must be that Samus can still be considered a fabrication, it's not the sort of characterization I'm talking about. If you'll recall, I mentioned in my other M video that Fusion's SAX could be a representation of who Samus is, just with all of her humanity stripped away. It could be the springboard for an introspective Samus questioning what her Chozo training and weaponry really mean in the grand scheme of things. Dark Samus in Echoes is a very similar representation, but rather than stripping away Samus's humanity, she acts as a contrast in personality and embodiment of gameplay traits taken to an extreme. As a video game character, Samus is characterized by her upgrades and growth throughout the course of an adventure. She is constantly absorbing local technologies in order to become a stronger warrior. Dark Samus is effectively the same thing, only absorbing Phazon instead. The core trait used to make Samus a formidable combatant, and to empower the player, is precisely what makes Dark Samus so frightening, not as a literal mirror or recreation like the SAX. Instead, Dark Samus has her own powers and abilities, all of which Samus does not possess. Just as Samus continues to change and develop new abilities, Dark Samus too transforms and develops new attacks. Dark Samus is not without personality, and neither is Samus in response. While she had all these traits in the original Prime, Samus's calm but cautious nature shines all the more strongly in contrast with Dark Samus's mocking confidence. If Samus Aran is a paladin, then Dark Samus is a scheming rogue or sorceress. Dark Samus exudes an evil impression of cool, whereas Samus is, well, more stoic, but not because she's boring or without emotion. In truth, I think Samus's rigidity and caution only exist because there's a fear of Dark Samus. If they added an increased heartbeat and heavy breathing to the fights with Dark Samus, I think it would be much more effective than the Ridley fiasco in Other M. That's right, you don't have to sabotage the cool, brave, and courageous aspects of Samus. In fact, it would only further emphasize that bravery because it confirms Samus is human. Samus feels fear, but she stands and fights nonetheless. Maybe I'm off base and people would complain anyway, but I really like that dynamic between the two. A dynamic that could be completely unintentional. I have no proof that Retro is doing anything more sophisticated than they thought would be cool. But even if it is all incidental, I think it really makes Dark Samus work as a villain within Echoes. More so, Samus herself is still not the central focus, but continues to be characterized by her response to the world. I'd say that's a pretty good template to work off of in future Metroid games. I could probably say more about Echoes if I really wanted. You know, like how the screw attack has some really awful hit detection at times and maybe wasn't the best idea after all. Would any of that really change Echoes' standing to the rest of the Metroid games though? Not really, because despite the minor nitpicks, I think Echoes has what it takes to perhaps be the best Metroid game. Of the 3D ones at least. I don't know if it is, but honestly I don't think it can really pinpoint any of the Metroid games as being the best. Heck, making these videos have caused me to appreciate Fusion more and more, and I used to hate that game. Each entry has their benefits and flaws, ultimately coming down to personal preference rather than what's the best. Even so, I think that a combination of Super Metroid and Echoes map designs lay the groundwork for making a truly incredible Metroid game. The sort that could bring together fans of the different styles and generations, replayable for years to come. I don't know why I was so unimpressed with Echoes all those years ago, but I'd like to encourage anyone that may have found it weaker than Prime to perhaps give it another go. As for me, I'm a bit sick of Metroid for the time being, so don't expect a video on corruption in the immediate future. However, I am working on another video already, and oh look, there's footage of it right there for you to see. I'm hoping to update more often in 2018, and I'm so sorry this one took so long, but full confession, I've decided to end RamblePak if I can't create at least 4 videos this year. I'm glad for every one of you that has discovered, shared, and commented on these videos, but I need to prove to myself this is something I truly love doing. My channel currently isn't monetized, meaning YouTube gives me no assistance in spreading the word, so while everyone finishes their videos with like, share, and subscribe, I could really use the assistance, especially given my lack of marketing charisma, so please don't just like and subscribe, but share, even though I just said I might not even keep doing these videos, whatever. You can also follow my Facebook, where I post my blog writings and a podcast I do called Hey Steve. So check out facebook.com/RamblePak64 if you'd like to read more of my ramblings. You can find links in the description below. No matter what you do, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you back here real soon.